This is an alert localized by the PD for Riverside, Muldraugh, Rosewood, and West Point County. A large military presence is reported throughout Knox County. They are seen turning away vehicles going through or out of Knox counties and blockading entrances and exits. We local authorities have yet to receive any clarity for this purpose. We recommend citizens to stay calm and wait for further news.
Josephine Ballard said goodbye to her roommate and drove off to work. He didn't seem to care much about the public safety announcement over the radio, but Josephine knew that something big was coming. It was her job to know, after all, her duty to the town of Muldraugh. She was a police officer, and a police officer was all that she had ever wanted to be. Her mother had told her that that's what God had wanted for her, and part of Josephine really believed that. Soldiers had thrown up roadblocks all over the county and wouldn't tell anyone what was going on or why they were there. It was all that anyone at work could talk about. The chief called Joe, he and everyone else called her Joe, by the way, in to tell her to check out these roadblocks and report back. The soldiers hadn't told the Kentucky State PD what was going on, just that they should stay out of the way. It was still early, so Josephine stopped by Green's for breakfast and took a stroll around the nearby shops. She made sure that the people and the soldiers saw that their police were still around and still keeping the peace in their town. A little movement also helped reduce the soreness from yesterday's workout. Josephine was in the best shape of her life. She was one of the best shots in the department, and she sure wasn't scared of any military types checking cars on the highway. Still, she wisely kept her distance as she eyed the roadblock. There had been shots from time to time, and the soldiers there were really twitchy looking, constantly pointing their rifles down the highway. Another roadblock going south had huge lines of cars leading to it in either direction. It was hard to tell what the soldiers were looking for exactly. Joe told the chief as much and did some paperwork at the station. It was a normal day, but until the soldiers were gone, Joe wanted to make sure that she was ready for anything. There hadn't been anything on the emergency broadcast channel, but something was happening for sure. A battalion of soldiers doesn't lock down an entire county for no reason. Departments all the way to Louisville were getting the same treatment. Even weirder, a guy just kind of ran into Joe's car on the highway. He even had a knife or something stuck in his back. Joe tried to stop him and maybe get him some help, but he would just not stop running, and also he hadn't really committed any crimes. He was probably on drugs, and Josephine believed in giving help to people who actually sought it out, so she let him go and didn't think about it anymore. After an otherwise uneventful day of patrolling, Josephine had almost made it home when she saw not only a loud house party, but one with the door broken down. Weird, they usually didn't get that wild around Muldraugh, so she quickly stepped in and checked it out. The partygoers seemed nervous and really not very party-like. They just stared at one woman who was smashing a door with her bare hands in the kitchen. Joe asked her if she felt okay, and she just kind of stopped. Nobody else at the party seemed to want to do anything, and they just looked very nervous and confused. It was bizarre, but Josephine felt that she would rather just go, so she left. Parties weren't illegal, and nobody seemed to mind the destruction of property. At least she'd managed to save a kitchen door that day, and so she went to sleep. The next morning was rainy. Other than everybody talking about the soldiers patrolling around, it seemed to be a pretty usual day. Still, there was a weird tension feeling in the air. People were nervous. Josephine geared up like always and started to drive around town. She prayed briefly for everything to be okay, for whatever storm was on the horizon to pass by without hurting anybody, though some selfish part of her wanted it to come, because whatever it was, Josephine Ballard was sure she was going to be ready for it. She bought canned food at Green's to stash in her car and stopped by the gas station to make sure her truck was topped up. Just as she was headed back to the police station to get some extra firepower from the armory, a call came in over the radio. Something bad at the school just up the road. An active shooter. Josephine hit the sirens and pressed the gas to fly up the road as fast as she dared. There wasn't any time to think. All she knew was that she was the closest officer, and her arrival could be the difference between life and death for someone whose safety was the essence of the job she had devoted her life to. Joe swerved to a stop right by the gate to the outer schoolyard. She drew her gun without hesitation and ran. Joe had never shot anyone before, and definitely not so many times, but he just kept raising his gun again. The shooter looked crazy, dead-eyed, insane. He had just gunned down a school teacher. There was nothing Joe could have done, she thought. She could have maybe shown up a little faster. Maybe another driving course could have changed that. Maybe she should have asked for a faster cruiser or stepped on the gas a little harder. Maybe that would have saved that teacher's life. The paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene. Another officer drove Josephine home. Standard protocol. They took her gun and gave her a new one. Someone else would investigate the shooting, and Joe was off duty until they were done. She hated that. Now of all times to be off duty was a horrible idea to her. Muldraugh needed her now more than ever. That shooter wasn't a normal person. He wasn't a jilted lover or an angry ex-employee or had whatever normal reasons some person would have to start shooting at a school. Joe knew what she had seen in that man's eyes. It was the sort of thing that made her believe it when her mom had told her that God had made her to be a police officer. There was pure insanity in that man's face, pure chaos. Not just drugs or hatred, but something completely alien, mindless. He was the embodiment of everything she had ever sworn to fight. He had been insane and dangerous, and weirdly enough, Josephine did not feel bad at all for having shot him dead. He just wouldn't stop trying to shoot her, and he would have done it for sure if she hadn't stopped him. What Joe really couldn't wrap her head around was what exactly had happened to the shooter and why. What had caused him to snap? Her roommate was hiding around back and chain smoking like usual, probably something with pot in it, but Joe didn't really care. She decided to head out and get some pizza. Hanging out at home was already getting very boring. Some guy kept coughing loudly as Joe ordered, but when she made it back home, her roommate was nowhere to be found. Which was weird, because he was usually the first in line when it came to free food, but Joe had to admit that she didn't really know him all that well anyway. That was a mystery she didn't bother pondering while she restlessly tried to pass the time. She knew that something big was happening right then, and that shooter was somehow connected to it. Joe had a theory, and so she went to Cortman Medical just up the street. She wasn't there officially, but it wasn't tough to see that there were a few people severely ill in the exact same way. Coughing, headache, hunger, irritability, and strangely high energy. The doctor there speculated that some new bug might be sweeping the town. She had never seen anything like it, and never so many cases so quickly. Josephine was ready to get chewed out when she got back to the police station, but the chief was actually relieved to see her. The shooting investigation was on hold, all hands on deck, and half of the department was coming down with some kind of cold. Meanwhile, things had been getting worse since the previous day. The shooter had not been an isolated incident. Josephine hated being right. She took a deep breath, she prayed quickly, and hoped that she was as ready as she thought she was. All the exercise and the time at the range and the training was going to pay off now or never. She had been preparing for years for something just like this. Joe flicked the radio on and found the crime had engulfed Muldraugh. The rest of the day was a haze. Joe grabbed a shotgun from the armory, no need for sign-outs today, and hit the first calls she heard that didn't have anyone already responding to them. She left the arson up the street to the fire department guys. They were on it just as quickly as she was. There was another insane guy wearing a mask just attacking people on a residential street. He didn't even flinch at Joe's warning shot. Then a man breaking and entering on the same street. She subdued him and brought him and the corpse back to the station. But the lockup was already full. It was already getting dark when Joe responded to armed robbers at the used store. They just wouldn't surrender, so Joe had to use her gun again. Part of her wondered if using firearms on people was too easy for her, and the rest of her said that was something she could worry about later in counseling. It was time to try and keep order now, as this violent sickness engulfed the town. The next morning, there was another murderer at the trailer park. Joe hadn't arrived in time to help his victim either, but at least there had only been one. She was headed back to the station. It had been a very long night and morning when there was another man in a sack mask attacking a random civilian, right there in front of the police station, as brazen as can be. Joe almost couldn't believe it when he suddenly exploded, and the flames burnt her too before she could back away and get a bandage on them. Then there was another explosion just up the street on the corner of the police station, another firebomber, and in moments, the station just started to go up in flames. The firefighters were there almost immediately, and Josephine was so thankful for their hard work, but it just wasn't enough. The station kept burning faster than they could put it out, and even when Joe tried to help herself with a nearby fire extinguisher, it didn't really help much. As soon as the armory fire was put out, the locker room was ablaze. There was nothing to do but watch the Kentucky State PD headquarters go up in flames, and then take a look at the man who had done it. He was dressed in some old military gear, rags, and armor made of wood. He looked like some sort of survivalist, some apocalyptic scavenger loony. The other bomber had been wearing a head sack too. They all looked like they'd lost their minds in the woods somewhere. Joe bought a healthy meal and gave herself a moment to eat it. If she didn't give herself a break, she would fall apart and just be useless to anyone. Besides, it gave her a chance to try and make some sense of the radio. It was an absolute mess. Dispatch was burnt to the ground, other towns were overwhelmed, and Muldraugh was just individual officers spread out trying to keep things under control wherever they were. The military still didn't tell them anything, but they were definitely shooting the looters. Jo did everything she could. Just up the street there were several more armed robbers, and a whole house full of barricaded suspects that she assisted some other officers in responding to. It was just too much, though. The break Jo had taken hadn't been enough. She was just exhausted, and her wound hurt so much. She'd been driving and responding to calls and fighting to keep order for over 24 hours. The burns hurt, and she knew she had to rest. It was a tough call to make. Maybe Muldraugh wouldn't be there tomorrow. No, Jo thought. If she was still breathing, then this town would never fall to whatever illness was doing this to people. She would have to pace herself. There had been even more people coughing than yesterday. This wouldn't be over soon. That night, several people tried to break into Jo's house. It didn't matter if she yelled at them or pointed a gun at them or whatever. They stole. They stole like she wasn't even there. They had to be insane with this sickness, infected with some kind of madness that made them take stuff even if it put them in mortal danger. So she shot them or beat them down and figured that was probably the right thing to do. The pain in Jo's burn had subsided somewhat, but there was no way she was going to be able to get back to sleep. There was a gun battle going on around Cortman Medical just up the street. A bunch of Jo's fellow officers fought to keep the place safe. They secured it, and hopefully it was enough. Josephine took it upon herself to drive around and check on the rest of the town. Thankfully, things were quiet for a few hours, but almost everybody was sick, coughing, even vomiting blood, and getting worse. Jo had a bad feeling that, though they'd restored some semblance of order for now, the worst was yet to come, and that this sickness was the reason why. An entire biker gang violently attacked the warehouse as Jo drove by. It was an absolute bloodbath. 5 crazed shooters against a crowd of workers. The place was covered in blood and stank of bodies. The coroner was overwhelmed. There were way too many corpses to process in Muldraugh, so Jo just let them sit there. She cared more about living people, and she took a moment to clutch her crucifix and pray that this would all pass. She grabbed some pizza for lunch, but her foot kind of hurt and must have gotten hit somewhere along the line in that gunfight. It was still crazy that the pizza joint was even open anymore, though, and she told them that they should close down and go home. The police station was still burning. When Jo's foot didn't get any better, she stopped by Cortman Medical to see if they could help her out, but the doctors were just gone, and the patients too, just disappeared. Maybe they also went on a crime spree. Maybe the soldiers had carted them off. Josephine went home to rest for a while again. She woke up to more crime on her street, another arson, and a fellow officer taken down by another crazy. The fire department never responded to the fire. They were overwhelmed like everybody else, Jo guessed. At this point, Jo was also too tired to feel bad for the shooter or the victims or anyone, really. She just got back in her car and kept patrolling, kept trying to assure everybody that things were okay and that they were maintaining order. Disorder breeds more disorder. Even the illusion of order would make things safer for everyone. It would make anyone who had not entirely lost their mind think twice about shooting or looting. That is what Josephine believed, and that is what she was fighting so hard for, even if it meant dragging corpses off of the highway just so that it looked like everything wasn't going so terribly. Still, people were clearly getting sicker, and even the video store of all places was having a big problem with theft. Big crowds of people taking VHS tapes. The clerks didn't bother trying to stop them, and neither did Jo. They were just tapes after all, and priorities had changed. Then they changed again. Then everything changed. The rules of life were flipped on their head just when it seems that things couldn't get any worse. Jo started to get calls on the radio about people who were sick, really sick, but not criminally insane or coughing, but bitey, cannibalistic, trying to eat people. They smelled like death and shambled towards anyone they saw and tried to bite into them and eat them. Joe wouldn't have believed what the other cops were saying over the radio if she hadn't just fought a couple herself. Other people were catching on just like Joe had, and a protest formed in front of one of the roadblocks. The military guys looked on nervously, and Joe called it in. The riot squad would be there soon enough, but she just didn't have the stomach for that sort of work that day and got out of there. Soldiers were shooting the infected people in the street. A gang of bandits set up in the local hotel, and Joe was the only officer who could respond, but luckily, she was enough. Her skills were paying off. It wasn't the criminals who worried her anymore, though. It was the people who walked around like they were half dead, like they were trying to eat people. One tried to bite into her near some shops, and he didn't stop until Joe cracked his head open with a nightstick. Whatever this illness had done to these infected people, they were relentless, immune to pain. Only bashing their heads to pieces would stop them. It was like they weren't even people anymore. To Joe, they couldn't be people anymore. They had to be something else. Otherwise, it made no sense. That illness had to have fundamentally changed them. Then another protest erupted downtown. Joe tried to tell them to go home, that provoking the soldiers wasn't good, that they needed protection and safety right now. And then a car just drove straight through them. The driver disappeared before anybody could react, and Joe never saw where he went, but many people were injured and dying in the street. The ambulances were all occupied or out of commission. Joe managed to convince the rest to disperse before any soldiers showed up. She really didn't think this was the right time for a protest. Then, there were shots at the site of the second protest, which was odd. The people had mostly left, and when Joe circled back around, she saw several infected people also acting strangely, trying to bite into other people as they shambled towards them, and the citizenry was fighting them off as best as they could. Joe recognized some of these cannibalistic people. Some were people who had been run over by the car just an hour or so ago. Even shooting them didn't seem to keep them down unless the bullet went through their head. Joe just couldn't believe what she was seeing. There was still nothing on the emergency channel, just more infected and crazy people. Citizens were breaking out their guns and defending themselves all over the place. They had lost faith that the police and the soldiers could handle whatever this was, and Josephine couldn't blame them, but she would fight to prove them wrong. She didn't fully realize how bad the illness was, though, until she drove into a little nest of shops next to the pizza place. There was a huge fight going on between healthy and infected there. Joe couldn't stop some of the healthy ones from being bitten, eaten. These infected people really were cannibals. Then, though, she found out that it was even worse than that. The healthy people that had died and the infected that had collapsed started getting off of the ground. What had been a parking lot full of still bodies just a minute ago became a huge crowd of the infected, crawling and stumbling and trying anything they could to get to Joe so they could eat her. She started to panic, dumping rounds into the crowd haphazardly. There were so many of them. There was so much death. When her pistol was dry, she fought them with her nightstick. Not a single one managed to bite her, but it seemed like more and more just kept coming. There were so many rising from the dead. The illness made people rise back up from the dead. She was fighting walking corpses, not people. Joe ran out of bullets, ran out of belief, ran out of hope for a moment. Even as she fought, the cold and fearful certainty of what she was fighting gripped her. She ran back to her car and drove away and hid in the night. She reloaded her guns, fed herself, but the whole time she was thinking about what she had found out. The walking dead were assaulting Muldraugh. Every person that had perished, every person that had died was another infected body to deal with. Every single casualty in the days-long fight against chaos would rise up and fight them. Joe realized why the soldiers had been so tight-lipped as she sat in the darkness. The other cops either wouldn't have believed them or would have run. The citizens, the people, they would have panicked. Now all they could do was fight for their lives. Joe woke up in her car at the side of the road and started to drive through the town. The military finally spoke up on the radio, said the truth that she had just figured out for herself, and said they were there to stay and fight and defend Muldraugh as much as they could. A depleted company of soldiers would try to hold the highway and a few roads in town. They didn't say anything about the sirens or the jets passing overhead. The police chief had long been missing, and the soldiers gave the orders now. Destroy the infected, all of them, wherever they were, wherever you see them. There was no other way to protect the living. The town of Muldraugh, their country, the world. Josephine had prepared her entire life for something like this, and now that she had an enemy to fight, an enemy of pure evil, she did it with something like excitement. She spent the whole day driving around town, defending the living if she could, but always destroying the dead. No more secrets, no more hesitation. Whatever weapons she found were all put to use. This was a fight for survival. The infected, looters, bandits. Josephine would die before she let them take over Muldraugh, her town. When she parked by the highway at night, away from town, she wasn't sure if they were winning or not. There were bodies everywhere, more arson, more gangs, more death than ever before. That night, the military bombed Muldraugh. Josephine tried to catch some sleep in her car in between the explosions. She hoped it would help. Somehow. It never even occurred to her that she could have just driven away. This fight was her entire existence now. Jo felt like she was truly alive for the first time ever. The dead were everywhere, even in the burnt-out remains of the police station. The hard-working firefighters of a few days ago were the cannibalistic corpses of today. Josephine was numb to how insane that was. She could only fight, but that didn't mean that she would fight stupidly. She called on the radio to all remaining officers. There was no way they'd hold the entire town. It was time to make a stand, to hold an oasis of order in the midst of all this chaos and death. There were a couple of streets near her house. Josephine told all of the officers to converge there, where a few soldiers were also holding out against the dead. They would hold that street to the last and gather all of the survivors that they could. Several officers agreed, and Jo met them there. They cleared out the nearby houses along with some sort of citizen militia, anyone in the area who was willing to fight for their lives, and they fought very well. The tide was turning, Josephine felt. Their resistance was organized. The numbers of the dead were fewer. She could hear the gunfire from the soldiers by the highway. The soldiers hadn't broken yet either. She ran and drove around the town like a mad woman, fighting looters and corpses. There were less and less survivors too, though. Just more dead and more of the insane. Corpses in the street weren't even a surprise anymore, just part of the scenery. What was important was the amount of corpses that weren't still moving around was getting higher, and the amount that were trying to eat Jo and her fellow officers was getting lower. The difference was getting tangible. As she drove around southern Muldraugh, there were less and less of the walking dead to dispatch. Jo slept in one of the cleared-out houses. It was time to make at least one building secure, so when she woke up, she grabbed some tools and nails from a nearby warehouse and stashed them in the house. She drove around looking for bandits and infected, but it was mostly quiet. Their little oasis of security had held, expanded even. The soldiers radioed that they were holding the highway, and even there, the amount of gunshots and infected was less than the day before. Josephine started to dismantle the furniture in the house that she had chosen as her new stronghold. Soon she had boarded up the windows pretty nicely before driving around to check up on the local area again. She found actually more soldiers than infected. Really, there were just a few at this point, mostly coming to the town through the highway, but the soldiers had those entrances covered. There were still other officers out there too. They had managed to survive and were still fighting whenever they had to. Jo was so proud of all of them. They all shared in an almost heavenly task against apocalyptic odds. She slept again and walked outside of her secured house for another day of cleansing. She had destroyed more infected than she could count. She would have destroyed as many as she possibly could. But it was quiet outside, except for the sound of rain. Somewhere along the line, they crossed the invisible threshold. They had destroyed more infected than there were bodies left to infect. Maybe the world would still forever be different now. Maybe this wasn't quite over. Whatever the sickness was, Josephine had survived the outbreak, and thanks to her, some others had as well. She didn't hear any gunshots or any moans. Southern Muldraugh, at least, had survived. Order had prevailed, even if it was over a mostly dead town. She'd fought hard from beginning to end, and never let things completely become chaos. Never let Muldraugh fall. Joe prayed for the dead.